to do is I just want to spend a little bit of time just kind of giving you guys some more kind of background information as we continue with the Torah readings and the Torah studies that I'm sending out each week. Okay, so what's about to happen in the Torah lessons is, and pretty much starting with this week, is I'm about to show you how the Torah and the stories in the Torah are prophetic. Okay, how they're prophetic about future events. Okay, and so we're going to start looking at a lot of things and tying them together. Right? We already saw the story in Genesis chapter 10 about how Abraham had to go and sojourn in Egypt. Right? Remember, there was a famine in the land. Okay, and so again, just reading that story, you may think, okay, this is just part of Abraham's life. This is part of his history. Yeah, there was a famine in the land, and he had to go down to Egypt. Okay, yeah. But then what we did is we showed you another story in Genesis chapter 20. And in Genesis chapter 20, again, Abraham had to go and stay in a foreign land. He was in Gerar. He was in Gerar that time. But remember, we saw some of the same events repeat. Because remember, when he was in Egypt, he said to Pharaoh, hey, this is my wife, because he feared for his life, right? And then we saw that situation repeat in Gerar in Genesis chapter 20, when he went to King Abimelech and he said, hey, this is my sister. I'm sorry, my sister. Did I say wife earlier? Yeah. As I was talking, I was like, okay, I said wife earlier. All right, so that this is my sister, right? Because he feared for his life. Okay, so at that point, we could say, so we have two instances of that. But then we have the instance of Isaac, and that's going to be coming in the next Torah portion. But I'm going to scoot a little ahead in what I'm doing today, because Orlando's going to be teaching next week, so I'm not going to get a chance to cover it. So I just want to give you some of this background information. But then we see it happen in Isaac too. And so Isaac, when he's in Gerar, the same thing. The patriarchs are having to leave the land of Canaan because of this famine and go into a foreign nation. And then in that foreign nation, the king tries to take the wife of the patriarch. And so what's going on here is that this is all prophetic, and I'm telling you, it is so exciting. It is so exciting for me to be able to share what the Lord has shown me, and I'm sure He's shown many of you some of these things also already. But it's so exciting to be able to see the Bible come alive. Okay, and to be able to look at these stories and really understand, as I've said before, I've said this many times, when we approach the Bible, it's not so much that we want to read it and just interpret it, according to our own interpretation. What we want to do is we want to come to the Bible and we want to understand what He wants us to understand. What is His interpretation? What is Adonai's interpretation of the Scriptures? Okay, and so as we begin to see all of these stories come together, and as we make all of these connections, a beautiful picture is about to come forward. And this picture is that Abraham's life when he went to Gerar in Genesis 20, and Abraham's life when he went to Egypt in Genesis chapter 12, and Isaac's life when Isaac went to Gerar, coming up in Genesis chapter 26. Those are all prophetic pictures of the Egyptian exile of the nation of Israel and their eventual deliverance. Okay? That's what all of those stories are about. And so if you're keeping up, if you're studying the Torah lessons, I go through all of the connections and show this to you. That once you see all of the connections, it is abundantly obvious that this is what's going on. Now here's something else I want you to see. I want you to understand that, let's look at in Genesis chapter 12, it was only, let's say, Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. Verses 10 through 20 are about Abraham's sojourn in Egypt. Okay? It was only those few verses. But then, when you get to Genesis chapter 20, in his sojourn in Gerar with the Philistines, the story is a little longer, and it includes some other prophetic details about the children of Israel, about their eventual bondage in Egypt. Okay, and then when you go to Isaac, we see even more detail about the future Exodus. So in other words, as we read the stories in the Torah, as we go from Genesis chapter 12 and see that story of exile and redemption, as we go to Genesis chapter 20 and see that story of exile and redemption, then we go to chapters 24 through 26, which is all about Isaac, right? And we see those stories of exile and redemption. As we continue, more and more prophetic detail is given. Okay? That's the point. Okay? So that's why I wanted. So there are many things that I put in the lesson, but there's some things that I can't put in the lesson. Otherwise, the lesson will be like 50 pages every week, right? And so I just want to bring out some of that here. So I want you to realize what's going on here. Okay, that what's going on here is Adonai is using these stories to teach us about the eventual exile and redemption of the nation of Israel. And that each story, he's building it and he's adding new information. So each one of these stories is slowly giving us more and more prophetic information about the exile. Okay? Now, here's something else that's going on. This is what's going on. Once we made all those connections, that the story of Abraham's exile in Egypt and his exile in Gerar and Isaac's exile in Gerar, once we understand that those are all prophetic stories of how Egypt will one day be taken into captivity in Egypt, once we understand that, what it does is it shows you the importance in Adonai's eyes of the story of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. You see what I'm saying? Because all of these other stories are pointing to their Egyptian deliverance. Okay, see, it's beautiful. It's beautiful how Adonai has done this. Once we make all these connections, it's absolutely beautiful. Because in this way, when we understand that all of those stories of the patriarchs are nothing more than prophetic foreshadows of the children of Israel going down into Egypt and being in bondage and then their eventual deliverance. Once we understand that, we understand that this is that Adonai is focusing. He's using these other stories to focus on the Egyptian bondage and deliverance. Okay, it is a premier event in the Old Testament, especially in the Torah, but in the Old Testament, it is the premier event. And the event of the children of Israel going into Egypt and being held in bondage and then their redemption is also the prophetic blueprint for everything else, the end times, and especially for Messiah. Okay? Now let me give you, I just want to review, and we do this in the lesson, we want to review again how I said how as we go from Genesis 12 to Genesis 20 to Genesis 24 through 26, Adonai has given us a little bit more information. Like we start off with this much information in Genesis 12, we'll get this much information in Genesis chapter 20, and then Genesis 24 through 26, he gives us all sorts of other information. Okay, so here we go. So we've talked about this, how Abraham is a picture of the Father, all right? So what's happening here is you can see these prophecies. Abraham, in some sense, is a picture of the Father, and Sarah is a picture of the nation of Israel. Okay, but Abraham's also a picture of Moses, and we go through all those connections there. We go through all those connections, so I'm not going to go through them here. But so when Abraham, when he goes into Egypt and Gerar, and when Isaac goes into Gerar, there's this question about keeping the patriarch alive. Now, they weren't fearing for their lives for no reason, right? When they would go someplace and they said, hey, tell them you're my sister, They weren't just making that up. They knew what happened back then. They knew that potentially could happen. So in other words, what's happening here is when Abraham and Isaac, when they go into Egypt and Gerar, there's a fear that the king is going to snuff out the life of the patriarch. Okay? In other words, the male seed of the covenant family, right? They're fearing that the king is going to kill the male seed of the covenant family. And when I say covenant family, I just mean the offspring of Abraham and Isaac. The offspring of Abraham and Sarah, right? So there's that fear. Well, see, prophetically, what that is this a picture of what happened when the children of Israel went into Egypt. Because remember, Pharaoh made the decree, and what did Pharaoh say? Kill all of the male children and let the female children live. And so you see that theme, that's an important theme. That theme in the story of the patriarchs is the prophetic picture that helps us see ahead of time and really understand when it happens, when it happens in the book of Exodus, that every time Abraham and Isaac were fearing for their lives, that was because in the future, that's exactly what would happen. Okay, that's exactly what would happen. The Egyptians would say, we're going to kill the male, but we're going to let the female live. And how can we not see every time the patriarchs, they go into exile, either Egypt, Gerar, and they come out with what? Lots of wealth. Right? They come out with all sorts of wealth. Now, in those stories, it's because the king, either Pharaoh or King Abimelech, once they see that this sister is really a wife, they give all sorts of goods. You know, whether it's servants, male servants, men servants. They give maid servants. They give them animals and things like that. But the patriarchs wind up leaving their captivity, as it were, with all sorts of wealth. Well, and the reason why that occurs in all of those stories is because all of those stories are prophetic foreshadows of how the children of Israel would one day go into Egypt. And when they left, remember Adonai said, tell all the women to do what? Ask from their neighbors for everything, right? And it says that they did what to the Egyptians? What word does it use? It says they plundered them. They plundered the Egyptians, just like Abraham and Isaac did. And then also, how can we not miss in the story of Abraham going down into Egypt, it says that because Pharaoh took Sarah, that Adonai sent plagues in Pharaoh's house. Right there in Genesis chapter 12. And then remember when Abraham, when he went to Gerar, it says that Adonai has stopped up the wombs of the women in Abimelech's kingdom. Okay? And so in both of those instances, those are prophetic shadows of the plagues. Remember, I think there were 10 plagues that Adonai sent upon the Egyptians because they had taken his bride. Because Israel was Adonai's bride. Okay? And so all these stories are pointing to that. So we're going to look at one other aspect. So remember I told you each story is building upon the prophetic picture. Okay? It's building upon the prophetic picture of how the lives of the patriarchs are prophetic pictures of what's going to happen to the children of Israel. So when we get to chapter 24, and there's the search for the bride for Isaac. Okay? There's a search for a bride for Isaac. And remember, the servant of Abraham, what's his name? Eliezer. It never says his name. He just said, all throughout Genesis 24, it just says the servant of Moses. The servant of, it's not the servant of Moses. The servant of Abraham, right? The servant of Abraham, but it was Eliezer. But we see that Eliezer, he goes to a foreign country, right? He goes to a foreign land, and then he winds up at a well, right? And then while he's at the well, while he's at the well, that's where the future bride, Isaac's bride, comes, and then she performs an act of service by getting water for all of his camels, right? Okay, well, and then we see that with Moses just happens to go to a foreign country, right? And Moses just happens to go to a well, right? And then Moses meets his future bride at the well, right? And then Moses does a great act of service for his bride and her sisters because of the other shepherds that were trying to drive them away from the well, right? So we see all the same things that are happening in Genesis 24 are happening in Exodus chapter 2 with Moses. So in other words, remember I told you that each one of these stories is adding more to the prophetic picture of what we're going to read about once we get to the book of Exodus. Yes, Lizzie. Foreign, that means from somewhere else. Okay, like if I got a foreign bride, that means that I married someone from another country, from somewhere else. You're welcome. All right. Foreign. She wanted to know what foreign meant. All right. So that's what's going on here, and so we can see that in this story. And so just as Isaac's bride was brought to him when she performed an act of kindness at a well, so likewise that's what happened in Moses' life. So in other words, in the Torah lesson, I give you all sorts of connections. This is just touching the surface here. Okay, so I take you through the scriptures. I take you through a scripture in, let's say, Genesis 24, and then I'll say, how can you see this in the life of Moses? And we just go one after another, boom, boom, boom. We don't include them all, as I said, otherwise each lesson would probably be 100 pages long, forget 50 pages. But we give you enough so that you can see that. And so as you work through these lessons, what's going to happen is you are learning for yourself. So I'm prompting you. Now the answers, yes, the answers are in the back, but I try to ask the questions in such a way that with a little bit of thinking and a little bit of reading, a little bit of diligence, you're going to figure it out on your own. Okay? And so you're going to be working this out. So it's just slowly working this out, and so that you can see it. And so, in other words, this story with Isaac in Genesis 24, finding a bride for Isaac, and then continuing in chapter 26, this is all a prophetic picture of Moses, the actual deliverer of the children of Israel. We're starting to get a picture of the deliverer, how the deliverer of the children of Israel would meet his wife at a well in a foreign country, right? And remember how Rebecca, once Eliezer talked to her, and Rebecca ran and told her family about what did Zipporah and her sisters do? They ran home to Reuel and they told him about Moses. And so it's all repeating. And this is why all these stories are repeating. Because the Bible is trying to paint this beautiful, beautiful picture of what's going to happen. And so Adonai is focusing our eyes all on the book of Exodus. Okay? Now, something else is happening though. So we're seeing how the patriarchs, their prophetic pictures, each one of them is a prophetic picture of Moses. Okay? Of Moses. All right? So, for instance, no, I'm not going to do that. So each one of them is a prophetic picture of Moses. But what else do we know? We know that in Deuteronomy chapter 18, I believe it was, Moses prophesied that the Lord was going to send a prophet like unto him. Remember that? That Adonai was going to send a prophet like unto him. And Adonai said, that prophet you must listen to. Okay? You must listen to that prophet. And now we know that that prophet is Yeshua. And so the point is that the patriarchs are all pointing us to the children of Israel in exile and Moses, okay? But Moses is going to be pointing us to Yeshua. Okay? Moses is going to be pointing us to Yeshua. And so I want to make 2 points here. Which one should I go for first? Okay. Let's go back. Somebody remind me, please, that I want to connect Moses to Yeshua. Moses to Yeshua. But I want to go back and just finish off one last thing. So Genesis chapter 12, Abraham in Egypt, short story. Genesis chapter 20, Abraham in Gerar, some more details. Genesis chapter 24 through 26 is about Isaac in Gerar and finding a wife for Isaac. Wow, a lot more information, prophetic information about Egyptian exile. Now, see how it's increasing? Now, guess what's on the horizon with the story of Joseph? Right? You see that? So, as I said, each patriarch is going to give us more and more prophetic detail. And let me tell you something. When we get to the story of Joseph beginning in Genesis 37, the floodgates are open and you are drinking from a fire hydrant of prophetic prophecy about the exile from Egypt, but also about Yeshua Messiah. Because now I'm going to get back to that point, right? So you see that when we get to Joseph's life, from Genesis chapter 37 through chapter 50, it's just Adonai is just like, he's like, okay, we're going to remove the veil here. We're going to remove the veil. We're going to be very open that Joseph's life is a prophetic picture of the children of Israel going into exile, into bondage, and then their deliverance. And so as we continue with those Torah portions, you'll be able to see that. But here's the other point that I wanted to make is that Moses is a picture of Messiah Yeshua. And so as we watch Moses, we're also going to be learning about Yeshua and redemption. And so one of the things that happens, I think I did this in lesson 21, I can't remember, I think it was in lesson 21, where I made the connections between Moses at the well meeting his wife and Yeshua and the Samaritan woman, meeting the Samaritan woman at the well. And so in other words, what we do here is, as I've said, all of the patriarchs are prophetic shadows of what happens in Egypt. And Egypt involved Pharaoh, the children of Israel, and Moses. But Moses is a picture of Messiah. And so we can actually go back to all of these stories and see messianic prophecy too. Now in the Torah lessons, I haven't started concentrating yet on a lot of the messianic significance of these Torah stories. What I'm mainly concentrating on right now in the Torah lessons is connecting the stories of the patriarchs to the Egyptian exile. Once we get to the story of Joseph, that's when I'm going to do all three. So in one of these upcoming lessons, I think it's lesson 23, it gets to be so overwhelming, I just put a big chart at the end of the lesson. I just put a chart. And in the chart, it's going to have a column that says prophetic theme, and then it's going to have how it showed up in the lives of the patriarchs, and then a column how it showed up in the Exodus. So for instance, prophetic theme over here is going to be the male seed is threatened. In the story of Abraham in Egypt, it's going to talk about how Abraham feared for his life, but Sarah was going to live. And then over in the Exodus, it's going to talk about how they tried to kill the males. And we just go through it, and we're going to have a table, a three-column table that's going to go boom, 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 boom. Okay? But then once we get to Joseph, what we're going to do is we're going to show not only how that theme applied to the patriarch, and then to the Exodus, we're going to show how it applied to Messiah Yeshua, how it applies to Messiah Yeshua also. And so we're going to continue to add upon that. But one of the things that I went ahead and shared with you guys, I can't remember if it's this week's or last week's lesson, about how when Eliezer went to the well and he met Rebekah, and when Moses went to the well and met Zipporah, those are all prophetic foreshadowings of Yeshua going to the well, right, in Samaria and meeting the Samaritan woman, right? And so what you do when you make these connections, quite often what you want to do is you want to watch the parallels, okay? There are things that are going to be similar. And those are the things that guide you into making the connection, okay? Abraham's servant came from one land to another land. Moses went from Egypt to Midian. Abraham's servant sat at a well. Moses sat at a well. Okay, a woman came and she performed an act of kindness for the servant. Little twist, Moses provided an act of service for Zipporah and her sisters, right? Now get this. So, and so you can apply that to John chapter 4 when Yeshua meets the Samaritan woman at the well. It says that Yeshua was traveling and had to go through Samaria, right? So he was traveling somewhere else, just like the servant was and just like Moses was, right? And he came to a well, right? And he was thirsty. And just like Eliezer asked the woman for a drink, so Yeshua asked the Samaritan woman for a drink. And then think about it, and then the disciples, they're like, what are you doing? You know, they're thinking, why is he asking her for a drink? Number one, she was a woman, right? And, you know, the culture back then. And number two, she was a Samaritan. And so they're wondering, why is he asking her for a drink of water, right? And so remember John at the end of his gospel in John chapter 20, 21, he says that if all the things that Yeshua had done had been written, that there would not be enough books that could contain all of the information, right? So in other words, when he says that, what we know is this, is that whatever the evangelists recorded in their gospels, it was thought out, and they were making sure that they took the best information that they could to convey the message. And so what I'm saying to you is that the reason why John, in the Gospel of John, the reason why he included the story, because none of the other disciples and the other evangelists, they didn't include, I don't think that they included the story of Yeshua meeting the Samaritan woman at the well. Okay? But John did. The reason why he did that is because he wants us to make the connection to Moses and Eliezer meeting the future bride at a well. So all of those parallels, but then you have some things that are different or odd. And whenever you see something that's a little different, that's where there's some wisdom there. There's some understanding there. So remember, we talked about how when Eliezer and when Moses met their brides at the well, we saw how everything was the same. And I haven't even gone over all the connections. We saw a little bit of a twist where Rebecca performed the act of kindness versus Moses performing the act of kindness, right? But the theme is still there to keep the pattern going. But here's something that's really strange. When Rebecca comes to the well, it says that she was a virgin, right? It says she was a virgin. But you know what? When Yeshua went to the well, that woman that came to the well, she was not a virgin, right? And as a matter of fact, remember when Eliezer went and he met Rebecca. And he started asking Rebecca some questions, right? He started saying, well, whose daughter are you? He's asking her something about her family relations, right? Something about her family relations. What did Yeshua do to the woman at the well? He started asking her a question too, didn't he? And didn't he ask the woman at the well a question about her family relations, right? He said, what exactly did he say? He says, pardon? Go tell your husband, right? Right? And actually, let me read something here because I want to see I can't remember. I'm going to look this one up. So Luke chapter 4. Let's look at that. Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah.